Welcome. You're listening to Detective Duo, bringing you tales from the golden age of mystery, adventures in the spirit of Tommy and Tuppence Beresford. Tap subscribe to stay with us and share where in the world you're listening from. Tuppence Beresford stood back from the mantelpiece with the solemn intensity of an artist contemplating a half-finished masterpiece. A porcelain shepherdess, 2 brass candlesticks, a miniature clock, and a pair of framed photographs had just undergone what she privately termed a necessary realignment of household aesthetics. To the casual observer, nothing at all had changed. To Tuppence, the entire emotional balance of the mantel had shifted by an inch, literally. It was positively askew, she murmured, nudging the shepherdess a fraction to the right. From the armchair behind her, Tommy lowered his newspaper just enough for one eyebrow to appear. "My dear girl, if detectives ever dust this mantle, they'll discover your fingerprints in positions that defy known laws of physics. I don't believe it has remained in one configuration for more than 10 minutes since the armistice." Tuppence gave him a sharp, affectionate glance. "You're mocking me." "Only a little, purely for my own amusement." She repositioned the candlestick again, then froze, head tilted like a bird listening for distant thunder. No, that's still wrong. You see, Tommy, the left side feels visually heavier. One can't have a mantelpiece listing to port like a drunken sailor. Then I'll fetch the Navy at once. But even Tommy's dry humour couldn't distract her from her mission. She lifted the miniature clock, turned it, considered its moral failings, and set it down at an infinitesimally different angle. She had just begun adjusting a picture frame when a brisk knock sounded at the front door. "That'll be Albert," Tommy said, folding the newspaper. "He never knocks like a human being, always like a messenger from the trenches." Albert indeed burst in a moment later, cheeks red from the cold and expression brimming with self-importance. "Post for you, sir, and madam, special-like." Tuppence took the envelope. It bore their address, written in a neat, deliberate hand, and carried an unfamiliar postmark, Little Wiven-on-Canal. "Where on earth is that?" she asked. "Sounds rural," Tommy replied. "Possibly agricultural, perhaps even muddy." "Mysterious, more like." She slit open the envelope with a hairpin, withdrawing a single stiff card and a folded slip of paper. The card displayed a rectangle of deep green, not a cheerful garden green, but something darker, duskier, almost brooding. She held it up to the light. "A paint sample." Tommy reached for the paper. "Perhaps someone admires your taste in mantelpieces." "Ha." She unfolded the note. A single sentence executed in the same neat hand read, "When the house is repainted, the truth will show. Before then, someone will die." Tuppence blinked. "Well, that's a trifle dramatic for a Tuesday morning." Tommy read it twice, expression tightening. "Albert, did you see who delivered this?" "No, sir. Just the postman. Looked ordinary enough." "Ordinary postmen," Tuppence murmured, "do not bring along paint samples as harbingers of doom." Albert hovered. "Shall I fetch tea, or smelling salts?" "Tea," Tommy said. "Always tea." Albert scampered off. Tuppence crossed to the breakfast table and set the ominous green sample card beside the butter dish. Its presence felt absurdly intrusive, like a stranger at the table eavesdropping on their toast. "What do you make of it?" she asked, arms folded. Tommy leaned forward, examining the card with detective-like precision. "The shade suggests exterior paint, something one might use on shutters or doors." Tuppence tapped the card. "It feels deliberate, a clue, a warning, something connected to that village, Little Wiven-on-Canal." She repeated the name thoughtfully. "It sounds peaceful, but that note isn't peaceful at all." Albert reappeared with the tea tray, looking as though he hoped for gunfire or secret agents. "Anything else, missus?" "No, thank you." Tuppence poured tea, her movements crisp, but distracted. When Albert left, she said, "Someone expects us to act. Why else send this to us? Investigators of discretion. They even used our old tagline." "A tagline which we no longer advertise," Tommy pointed out. "It's unsettling that they know it." "Unsettling? It's practically an engraved invitation." Tommy gave her a measured look. "You realize this could be a hoax, or an attempt to frighten someone, or a cry for help." She held up the note again. "When the house is repainted, the truth will show. That implies the repainting is already in progress, don't you think? Seems likely. And before then, someone will die. That suggests urgency. Or melodrama. Tommy, someone wrote that with trembling restraint. You can feel it in the handwriting. Tommy considered the sample card once more. In the morning light, the green had a strangely oppressive quality, as though it belonged not on a cheerful country cottage but on a place harbouring unwelcome memories. He sighed. I suppose you're about to propose. We go, she said firmly. Immediately. He gave a resigned smile. I knew you'd say that. And you agree. I am reserving agreement until after I've had another cup of tea. Tuppence reached across the table, touched his hand lightly. Darling Tommy, someone out there believes a life hangs in the balance. We can't sit here rearranging mantelpieces while a stranger in some village paints walls over a terrible secret. Tommy chuckled, squeezed her fingers. You make it sound quite compelling. It is compelling. He set down his cup. Very well. We'll catch the morning train, but I insist on one thing. Which is? Leave the mantelpiece alone for at least 24 hours. She huffed. You asked for the impossible. They shared a smile, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The paint sample card lay between them like a silent dare. It was only a scrap of colour, yet it radiated meaning, an invitation into someone else's fear. Tuppence picked it up again, studying its depth. It's almost the colour of deep water, she murmured. Still, shadowed, hiding whatever lies beneath. Or, Tommy said soothingly, it's just paint. She shot him a knowing look. You don't believe that. He didn't. And when the clock chimed 9:30, they both rose without further discussion. Their bags would be packed, a train timetable consulted, a quiet village approached with caution. The mystery had begun, not with a corpse or a scream or a thunderclap, but with the unsettling normalcy of a colour card resting beside buttered toast, promising that beneath a fresh coat of paint, something long hidden waited to be revealed. Tomorrow, they would go to Little Wyvern on Canal, and whatever truth awaited there had already started brushing at the edges of their lives, stroke by deliberate stroke. The train hissed to a halt with the weary sigh of a creature that had carried too many secrets too far. Tuppence stepped down first, taking in the small station sign, Little Wyvern on Canal, painted in cheerful blue that somehow failed to make the place feel cheerful. Tommy followed with their suitcase, glancing around with the instinctive alertness of a man accustomed to stepping into mysteries rather than out of them. Well, Tuppence said, hands on hips, if the village hides murder, it does so behind an impeccably scrubbed facade. The station was spotless, the platforms swept, the station master polishing a brass handle with the zeal of a man who judged his own worth by the shine of metal. And yet, beneath the neatness, something felt expectant, as though the air itself held its breath. A boy pushing a bicycle paused mid-stride when he saw them, eyes darting from Tommy to Tuppence and then to the suitcase. He sped off immediately. That's one greeting, Tuppence murmured. Friendly chap, Tommy replied, positively overflowing with hospitality. They began walking down the narrow lane that led from the station to the heart of the village. Little Wyvern nestled comfortably between gentle slopes, its houses arranged like gossiping neighbours, whispering over garden hedges. A stone bridge arched over the canal, and the water, calm, dark, unhurried, reflected the village with uncanny stillness. A cluster of barges sat moored along the towpath. Their painted panels were bright, but the people beside them were not. A woman scrubbing a bucket stopped when Tuppence passed. Two men coiling a rope muttered under their breath. A white-haired gentleman paused in tapping his pipe and watched them, unblinking. Tommy leaned close. Either we've arrived in a village of introverts, or someone has been issuing warnings about suspicious couples. Tuppence smiled thinly. We did get invited, remember? Sort of. They approached the small grocer's shop to ask directions. The bell above the door chimed with exaggerated brightness, but the shopkeeper, a wiry man with a quick, nervous blink, stiffened the moment Tommy asked, Could you point us toward the house by the canal, belonging to Mrs. Vale? The man dropped a tin. It clattered across the floor like a startled comment. Mrs. Vale, he said sharply, what business have you there? We're visiting, Tuppence replied, all innocence. He looked from one to the other, assessing, calculating. I see. His voice grew guarded. Her house is at the end of the towpath. Can't miss it. Being repainted. He hesitated, then added quietly, You be careful what you go poking at. Before Tuppence could press further, he waved them off with sudden urgency. Best be on your way. Outside again, Tommy said mildly. That went well. Tuppence's eyes glimmered with interest. The man practically vibrated with suppressed alarm. Something here is very wrong, Tommy. They followed the towpath, the canal gliding alongside like a long, ink-dark ribbon. A faint smell of wet wood and distant coal drifted from the barges. Soon the houses grew sparser until only one stood ahead, a modest two-story structure painted in a deep green so heavy it swallowed light. The exact shade, Tuppence said softly, pulling the paint sample card from her handbag. It matched perfectly. A ladder leaned against the wall, paint tins stacked neatly below. No painter in sight. Tommy knocked at the door. After a long pause, it opened to reveal Mrs. Imogen Vale, a slender woman in her late 70s, hair pinned in a soft, cloud-like arrangement, cardigan buttoned unevenly, as if she had dressed in haste. Her expression shifted rapidly from polite welcome to faint alarm. "Yes?" she asked. "Mrs. Vale," Tuppence said warmly, "we received a letter which seems connected to your home. May we speak inside?" Mrs. Vale blinked, glanced behind them, as if checking the towpath for eavesdroppers, then nodded. "Very well. Come in. Quickly, please." They stepped into a small hallway filled with the faint scent of linseed oil and old furniture. Mrs. Vale led them to a parlour where a half-finished painting rested upon an easel. It depicted the canal at night, moonlit water, the reflection of a barge's lantern, but a section of the towpath had been smeared over with thick, opaque green brushstrokes. Tuppence moved toward it instinctively. "Your work?" "Once," Mrs. Vale said quietly. "Not any more. My hands shake too much these days." Tommy studied her. "Mrs. Vale, we received a letter, postmarked from this village. It contained a warning and a paint sample matching your exterior." Mrs. Vale's skin drained of colour. I didn't send any letter." "May we show you the sample?" Tuppence held out the card. Mrs. Vale recoiled before catching herself. "Where did you get that?" "It was sent to us," Tommy answered, with a message implying danger. She pressed a trembling hand to her cheek. "I never meant—" She stopped abruptly. "I never asked for anyone's involvement." "But someone did," Tuppence said gently, "and they believed you needed help." Mrs. Vale turned away, staring at the obscured painting. "People talk too much in this village, and too little. They see things and pretend not to. They know things and keep them hidden under fresh coats of paint." Tuppence's eyes narrowed. "That's a curious choice of phrase," before Mrs. Vale could respond. Tommy's gaze snagged on something. Faint scratches along the back door visible through the parlour doorway. Long, uneven, irregular marks, as though someone had tried forcing entry with little finesse. "Have you had trouble with intruders?" he asked. Mrs. Vale hesitated. "Just the wind. Doors swell, you know." "That's swelling of a very determined sort," Tommy murmured. Tuppence turned back to the unfinished painting. She touched the edge of the green smear. "Why cover the towpath?" Mrs. Vale swallowed. "Because it is better unseen." Before they could ask more, the faint thrum of an engine drifted from outside. A canal barge chugged past the house. At its helm stood a broad-shouldered man with a dark cap pulled low. He looked directly into the parlour window, expression sharp with scrutiny. Mrs. Vale stiffened. "That's Mr. Linton. He lives on his barge, delivers goods, watches everything." "Watches us, certainly," Tommy said. "And that watchfulness," Mrs. Vale whispered, "has a purpose. Everyone here has a purpose. Some harmless, some not." The words hung in the room like settling dust. When they took their leave, Mrs. Vale walked them to the door but did not step outside. "If you value your peace," she said softly, "you will forget whoever wrote to you. Forget this house. Forget me." Tuppence touched her hand. "I'm afraid we can't." Mrs. Vale's eyes brimmed with a sorrow tinged by unmistakable fear. As they walked back toward the village centre, Tommy said quietly, "Well, subtlety is not her strong suit." "No," Tuppence replied, "but fear is, and fear that large rarely grows alone. Someone in this village wants silence, and someone else wants truth." They paused upon the little stone bridge. The canal drifted beneath them, calm yet somehow secretive. Tommy rested his hands on the railing. "So, what do you think, partner of mine?" Tuppence's gaze swept the towpath, the barges, the distant figure of Mr. Linton tying a rope in slow, deliberate motions. "I think," she said, "we've stepped into a story where the village knows the ending but refuses to read it aloud." "And the repainting of that house is not decoration," she finished. "It's concealment, or perhaps erasure." Tommy nodded slowly. "Then we'd better start peeling back layers." Tuppence smiled faintly. "Every mystery, my dear Tommy, begins somewhere. This one begins with a house by a canal, and a shade of green someone hates enough to kill for." They walked on, the village watching, always watching, from doorways, windows, barges and shadows. The secret lay somewhere here, and little Wyvern, with all its charm and quiet dread, was not ready to give it up. Morning in Little Wyvern on Canal began not with bird song or church bells, but with the discordant clang of a dropped paint tin somewhere near the towpath. Tuppence heard it the moment she and Tommy stepped outside the small inn, a sharp metallic protest that sliced through the village's guarded quiet. Two villagers standing near the green exchanged glances before pretending they had not heard a thing. Tuppence, watching them, murmured, "Something's off. They look like people waiting for unpleasant news they already know." Tommy nodded, or news they hope won't be traced back to them. They walked toward Mrs. Vale's house, expecting to find Edwin Roach already at work repainting the dark green exterior. Instead, the ladder stood untouched, brushes neatly laid out, and no sign of the man whose arrival usually preceded sunrise. A woman sweeping her doorstep paused mid-stroke, eyeing the empty worksite with something like dread. Tuppence offered a friendly greeting, but the woman turned abruptly indoors. "Friendly place," Tuppence muttered. Tommy examined the paint tins. No disturbance here. Either he overslept or something prevented him from beginning. He paused, and I doubt oversleeping is the villagers' worry today. They followed the towpath, hoping Roach might simply be elsewhere working. The canal ran smooth beside them, its surface broken only by the lazy drift of a barge rope. Then Tuppence stopped. A paintbrush floated slowly in the water, bristles stained not only with the dark green they recognized, but also with streaks of vivid red. She crouched, retrieving it carefully. "Tommy," she whispered, "there's been no red paint on that house." Tommy examined the red streaks with a frown. "Primer, or something else entirely?" Tuppence's stomach tightened. People don't vanish before breakfast for innocent reasons. They carried the brush to the lockkeeper, who had been leaning on his hut's doorway with the posture of someone hoping to appear uninvolved. When he saw the red-streaked bristles, his expression flickered. "Haven't seen Roach since last night," he said. "Probably sleeping it off." Tuppence said, "Does he usually leave his tools drifting down the canal?" The man shifted. "Maybe dropped it," Tommy asked. "And the red?" The keeper stiffened. "No idea. Best ask him yourself." But his eyes darted toward the lock, where the faint churn of disturbed water hinted at more than he wished to say aloud. Moments later, a shout rose from behind the lock gate. Two men wrestled with something heavy caught against the timbers, water lapping with ominous persistence. As Tommy and Tuppence hurried forward, the shape resolved into a man's body. Edwin Roach lay limp, clothing soaked, face pale beneath water-darkened hair. Tuppence's breath hitched. A villager muttered, "Slip of the bank." Another said, "Too much ale." Yet something in their tones carried forced certainty. Tommy knelt beside the body, examining boots that should have been thick with towpath mud, but were immaculate. "No slip," Tommy murmured. "He was placed here after the fact." Tuppence crouched opposite him, gently lifting Roach's hand. Beneath the fingernails were dried flakes of dark green paint. "He scraped something," she said quietly. "Perhaps a wall, perhaps something freshly coated." Tommy nodded grimly. "Or something he wasn't meant to uncover." The constable arrived then, trotting with the reluctant energy of a man summoned to an inconvenience. He took one look at the scene and announced, "Accident, clear as day." Tuppence stood, fixing him with a steady gaze. "Clear as fog, you mean? This man didn't drown himself by tidying his boots first." The constable bristled. "Best leave these matters to those responsible, madam." "Responsible for what?" Tuppence pressed. "Investigation or concealment?" Tommy intervened mildly. We merely found the brush. The constable glared. And I'll be taking it. Evidence of sloppy craftsmanship, nothing more. But Tuppence pulled it back. I think not. It was sent downstream from the house being repainted. We're keeping it until we speak to Mrs. Vale. Villagers began dispersing with the synchronized avoidance of people anxious to look uninvolved. One elderly man muttered, knew something had happened, knew it the moment the painting started again. His companion hushed him sharply. Tommy and Tuppence made for Mrs. Vale's house. They found her sitting in an armchair facing the cold fireplace, hands clasped in her lap with unnatural stillness. When Tuppence gently broke the news, Mrs. Vale let out a soft, fractured sound and slumped forward. Tommy steadied her as she whispered, I told them someone would pay. Too late, far too late. Tuppence knelt beside her. Mrs. Vale, what do you know about Edwin Roach's work here? But Mrs. Vale shook her head violently. I won't speak. I've said enough. You must leave. The unfinished canvas still dominated the parlour. Tuppence rose and approached it, studying the heavy green strokes masking the towpath. Did Roach paint over this? She asked. Mrs. Vale hugged herself. No, that was me. I couldn't bear to look at what used to be there. Tommy's inquisitive gaze sharpened. And what was there? Mrs. Vale answered only with silence. The back door caught Tuppence's eye, the same uneven scratches Tommy had noticed before, now more troubling in light of Roach's death. Someone had been trying to get inside, and recently. She turned back to Mrs. Vale. Did Roach disturb something while repainting your house? Mrs. Vale shuddered. Please go. Outside again, Tuppence exhaled slowly. She's terrified, Tommy. Not just shocked, terrified, as though she's been waiting for this. Tommy nodded. She knows more than she'll say, and that red paint suggests a cover-up rather than an accident. They returned to the towpath. The barge captain, Mr. Linton, stood on his deck coiling a rope. His expression was unreadable, but he watched their approach with unblinking interest. Tuppence called up, Did you see Edwin Roach this morning? Linton spat into the canal. Painter? Not since last night. Keep your noses out of village matters. His tone was controlled, but the warning beneath it was unmistakable. Tommy tilted his head. You dislike Edwin Roach? Linton's eyes narrowed. Didn't care for him poking around where he didn't belong, asking questions, wandering late. Tuppence sensed deflection. Wandering where? Nowhere, he snapped, vanishing into the cabin. Tommy sighed. So far everyone in this charming village either lies, evades, or falls dramatically silent. All classic signs of something deliciously suspicious, Tuppence replied. The question is what Roach found, or nearly found. Tommy glanced again at the water, its calm surface indifferent to the corpse now taken away, and why he ended up in the loch instead of finishing the repainting. The constable reappeared on the road above them, wiping his brow. I'll be filing this as an accidental drowning, no need for further fuss. Except murder, Tuppence said sweetly. His face reddened. We've no murderers here. Just dead painters, she replied. Strange coincidence. Tommy stepped forward. Constable, one question. Why were Roach's boots clean? The man spluttered, then stomped off, muttering something about outsiders causing trouble. Tuppence looped her arm through Tommy's. We're getting close to the heart of things, Tommy. I can feel it. Yes, he agreed quietly, and someone else may feel we're getting too close. They lingered outside Mrs. Vale's house once more. The untouched ladder felt almost accusatory. Tuppence tapped the paint sample against her palm. This colour sits at the centre of it, she murmured. Tommy nodded. Roach scraped something he wasn't meant to reveal. The dark green facade seemed to observe them. He died for it, Tuppence said quietly. Tommy scanned the towpath, sensing unseen eyes. And someone here hopes fear will keep everyone silent. As they turned toward the inn, the church clock tolled. A child paused, staring at them as though recognizing danger. Tommy murmured, We press on. Tuppence nodded. Roach left clues. Someone knows we've found them. The towpath stretched ahead, heavy with unspoken tension. The Red Wyvern Inn was the kind of establishment where conversations paused whenever the door opened, not out of politeness, but because every newcomer represented potential disruption to the finely balanced economy of secrets. When Tuppence stepped inside, all chatter halted for a moment, mugs suspended mid-air, eyes narrowing with calculating interest. Then the noise resumed, too briskly, as if trying to cover its own guilt. Mrs. Hawthorne, the landlady, polished glasses behind the counter with the vigour of a woman determined to erase every fingerprint she had ever encountered. She was round-faced, shrewd-eyed, and possessed of the sort of stare that could extract confessions from grown men. She gave Tuppence a curt nod. "Back again, are you?" she said. "You and your husband stirring the pot?" Tuppence smiled pleasantly. "The pot seems quite stirred already. I merely observe the simmering." Mrs. Hawthorne sniffed, unimpressed. "If you're here for gossip, try the village green. If you're here for answers, buy a lemonade." "I'll take the lemonade," Tuppence said, seating herself at the bar. "And perhaps one or two answers, if they come free with the drink." Mrs. Hawthorne poured with the air of someone granting a favour under protest. "Ask." "It's about Edwin Roach," Tuppence began softly. A few faces stiffened nearby. A spoon clattered in a saucer. "I hear he wasn't well liked." Mrs. Hawthorne's expression didn't shift, but her hands froze mid-polish. "Edwin Roach liked to pry," she said finally. "Pry at walls, pry at doors, pry at people's business. No one appreciates a man who believes everything ought to be uncovered." Tuppence tilted her head. "Is that why he argued with Mrs. Vale?" Mrs. Hawthorne's pause was too long to be innocent. "Who told you that?" "You did," Tuppence said lightly, "just now." The landlady's eyes narrowed with reluctant respect. "He said something foolish," she muttered. "Something about how the new paint might reveal more than it concealed." Mrs. Vale got upset. He left. That's all. "But what did he mean?" "How should I know? I run a pub, not a clairvoyance booth." Tuppence sipped her lemonade. "People argue, people drown, but they don't usually do both on the same day by coincidence." Mrs. Hawthorne slammed a glass down with enough force to rattle it. "Leave it alone, Mrs. Beresford. Some things here don't need digging up." "And others," Tuppence returned steadily, "desperately do." Before the landlady could retort, the door banged open and Mr. Linton, the barge captain, strode inside. His boots thudded heavily, leaving faint tracks of canal mud. His eyes flicked to Tuppence, hard and unwelcoming. "You again," he growled. "Haven't you and your husband meddled enough?" "I've barely begun," Tuppence said sweetly. Linton grunted. Roach was trouble, always nosing around the towpath after dark, poking near moorings, asking me about things that didn't concern him. "What things?" Tuppence pressed. "The past," Linton muttered. "Things that were done or not done or should have been done long before you people arrived." A silence followed, heavy, suggestive. Then he turned on his heel and left, slamming the door behind him. Mrs. Hawthorne leaned in. "He's right, you know, about Roach." "You mean Roach was asking inconvenient questions?" Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze flickered. Roach had a sharp tongue. He liked reminding people that truth has a habit of climbing out of graves. Tuppence's pulse quickened. "Which people?" No answer. Just a stare that said, "You know better than to ask that in public." Meanwhile, Tommy had taken the opposite approach. Instead of probing villagers, he examined Roach's trail. The village carpenter had been repairing a chair outside his shop when Tommy approached. "Terrible business," the carpenter said, before Tommy even introduced himself. "Drowning like that?" "You knew Roach well?" Tommy asked. "Only by the noise he made, always tapping, scraping, hammering even when nothing needed hammering." The carpenter sighed. He had a peculiar interest in Mrs. Vale's house. Used to ask me about the old renovation. "What renovation?" "During the war," the carpenter said, lowering his voice. "Mr. Vale had me reinforce a particular section of the wall. Didn't tell me why. Paid handsomely. Strange, though. Roach asked me about that very section not a week ago." Tommy considered this. "Did Roach say why he was interested?" "Said he heard something while sanding, hollow-like." "And did you tell anyone this conversation?" "No. Didn't fancy becoming village news." Tommy thanked him and continued toward Mrs. Vale's house, his mind sorting the information with methodical precision. Tuppence met him at the gate. "You'll like what I've learned," she whispered. "Or hate it. Hard to say." "I can say the same," Tommy replied. Inside, Mrs. Vale sat before her unfinished canvas, staring at the thick green blotches as though they were alive. The scent of turpentine hovered in the air, faint but unmistakable, even though no artist had worked here in days. Tuppence approached gently. "Mrs. Vale, we need to ask you again about this painting." The elderly woman's eyes filled with alarm. "Please don't. I shouldn't have kept it. I should have burned the wretched thing." Tommy stepped closer. "Your husband painted it, didn't he?" Mrs. Vale nodded slowly. "Years ago, when the house was still pale cream, he captured the canal beautifully. But later he said one section troubled him. He painted over it, then painted over it again, and then he obscured it completely," Tuppence finished. Mrs. Vale clasped her trembling hands. "He told me something was hidden beneath the old paint on the wall. He didn't say what, only that it wasn't his secret to reveal." Tuppence exchanged a look with Tommy. "And Edwin Roach?" she asked gently. "Did he find something while repainting the house?" Mrs. Vale flinched as if struck. "He asked questions. Too many questions. He said the wall felt uneven, that the paint wasn't adhering properly, that something beneath was reacting strangely to the new coat." "And that scared you?" "Yes," Mrs. Vale whispered, "because someone else had warned me that if the truth came out, the past would destroy more than just my peace." "Who warned you?" But Mrs. Vale shook her head violently. "I can't say. I shouldn't even have spoken this much. Please, leave me. Leave this village." She rose abruptly and fled to the corridor, shutting the door behind her. Tuppence stared after her. "Something beneath the paint," she murmured. "Something her husband felt compelled to hide." Tommy examined the room with careful eyes. "And something Roach may have uncovered, or almost uncovered." They stepped outside through the back door. Tommy crouched to inspect the scratches again. Fresh marks, not weather. Someone tried forcing their way in very recently. "And succeeded?" Tuppence asked. He tested the latch. "No, but they tried hard." Tuppence walked toward the canal's edge. Tiny footprints dotted the soft earth, too small for Roach, too large for a child. "Someone has been circling this house," she murmured. "Someone nervous enough to prowl at dawn." Tommy joined her, studying the footprints. "And the villagers? They're united in silence." "Silence is often a pact," Tuppence replied, "and pacts usually have a fear at the centre." She paused, lifting her head. "Do you smell that?" Tommy inhaled. "Turpentine. Stronger outside than inside." They followed the scent around the side of the house. A paint tin lay toppled beneath a shrub, its lid sealed but the rim faintly sticky. Tommy pried it open. Inside was paint of the same dark green, yet streaked faintly with a reddish residue. "The same colour on Roach's brush," Tuppence whispered. Tommy replaced the lid. "Someone painted something in haste, covered something they didn't want seen, and they weren't careful while doing it." Tuppence straightened. "There's more. In the pub, Mrs. Hawthorne implied Roach threatened to uncover an old wrong, and Mr. Linton said Roach was searching late at night, asking about the past." "Both evasive," Tommy said, "and both troubled. And both terrified of what Roach found." They headed back toward the village centre. A man sweeping his doorstep froze when he saw them, then retreated indoors. A pair of women whispered behind cupped hands. Children playing marbles abruptly stopped, gathering their things and scattering as though warned to avoid the strangers. Tuppence leaned close to Tommy. "The village is closing ranks." "Which means we're asking the right questions." And they reached the green, where an elderly gardener was pruning roses with the slow patience of someone accustomed to watching secrets grow. Tuppence approached him. "Lovely garden." He nodded without enthusiasm. "Do you know anything about Mrs. Vale being blackmailed?" His shears paused mid-cut. Tuppence continued gently. "I've heard rumours." The gardener looked around, left, right, behind, then whispered, "Mrs. Vale received letters, nasty ones, threatening to reveal what happened long ago." "Who sent them?" He swallowed. "No one knows, but when Roach started repainting, the letters stopped." "Because the sender thought the repainting would hide something?" Tommy asked. "Or reveal something," the gardener whispered, "depending which side of the truth you stand on." A long silence followed. Finally Tuppence asked, "What truth?" But he shook his head, fearful. "Not mine to tell." Tommy and Tuppence walked on, exchanging a charged look. "Layers upon layers," Tuppence murmured. "Paint over paint, lie over lie." "And every layer resisting the one beneath," Tommy said quietly, "until something cracks." They reached the canal again. The water glided by with deceptive serenity, concealing more than it revealed. Tuppence touched Tommy's arm. "This isn't only about Roach. It began long before him." "Yes," Tommy agreed. "And if we don't uncover it soon, someone else may die." She nodded, eyes narrowing toward the dark green house in the distance. "Whatever truth lies beneath that paint," she whispered, "it's fighting very hard to stay hidden." Borrowing a barge, Tuppence decided, was rather like borrowing a temperamental horse. One needed both charm and determination, preferably in equal measure. Mr. Linton had stood on his deck, arm folded, jaw clenched, making it perfectly clear that the only reason he allowed such an indignity was because Tommy's request had been phrased with impeccable courtesy, and because Tuppence's steady gaze suggested refusal might invite more trouble than acquiescence. "I want her back exactly as she is," he barked, patting the railing as if the vessel were a prized pet. "No scratches, no dings, no meddling with my lines." "Not a rope out of place," Tommy promised. "And if you see anything suspicious," Linton added, lowering his voice, "you didn't see it." "Of course," Tuppence said cheerfully. "We see nothing, hear everything, and decide later which bits matter." Linton gave her a dark look, muttered something about outsiders, and stomped away. As twilight deepened, the barge rocked gently beneath their feet, its mooring rope tugging in slow, rhythmic pulses. The canal stretched in either direction like a whisper of water threading through the village. Ahead loomed Mrs. Vale's house, 2 stories tall, painted in the heavy, brooding green that now defined the mystery. A single lamp glowed faintly inside, though Mrs. Vale herself had retired early, shaken by the day's events. Tuppence settled beside Tommy on overturned crates they'd arranged as makeshift seats. "Stakeouts," she said reflectively, "are underappreciated as forms of marital bonding." Tommy smirked. "Only you could make espionage sound domestic." "Everything can be improved with the right attitude." "That," Tommy said, "is precisely the sort of philosophy that ends with us crouching on a borrowed barge in the dark." She nudged him affectionately. "Hush, look how beautiful it is." And indeed, the scene held cinematic charm. Lantern light from the barge casting soft reflections across the canal, the quiet creak of the tow rope, distant murmurs from the village drifting like half-remembered lullabies, and punctuating it all, the far-off hoot of a night train passing over the ridge. Yet beneath the beauty lay tension, the taut, humming variety that nestled into one's bones. Tommy adjusted his binoculars. No movement inside, all seems calm. Tuppence tilted her head. Calm never lasts long in a story like this. The barge shifted with a gentle lurch. A faint splash echoed somewhere behind them. Tommy turned but saw nothing except the ripple of water returning to stillness. "Probably a fish," he said, "or someone testing whether we're paying attention." "You truly cannot help yourself, can you?" "No," Tuppence said brightly. "It's why you married me." She lifted her own small pair of field glasses and trained them on the upper floor of Mrs. Vale's house. The lamp's glow flickered against the curtains, but something about the rhythm made her frown. "Tommy, look again." He adjusted his lenses. "What am I—" A sudden dimming of light, a flare of brightness, a shadow crossing the window, not Mrs. Vale's slight, stooped figure, but something taller, straighter, more purposeful. Tommy exhaled. "Someone is in the study." "At night," Tuppence murmured, "without Mrs. Vale's knowledge." The shadow paused by the window. The faint silhouette of an arm lifted, holding a lantern. A moment later, a soft but unmistakable sound drifted through the quiet. Scraping, not loud but deliberate, rhythmic, wood against wood, paint against blade. Tuppence's pulse quickened. They're prying something loose inside. Tommy rose. "We go now." They crossed the narrow gangplank to the towpath, moving quickly but quietly. The moonlight traced their figures as they hurried toward the house, keeping low near hedges and shrubs. Another scrape, another shift of lantern glow. Tuppence pointed. "There, downstairs, by the staircase." Tommy reached the back door. It was unlocked. He frowned. "She never leaves it open." Which means the intruder entered this way. They slipped inside, the dim interior smelling of old fabric, drying paint, and something sharper, turpentine, faint but present. The house seemed to hold its breath, listening. From the upper landing came the soft thud of a footstep. Tommy motioned upward. Tuppence nodded. They crept up the staircase with practiced stealth, Each step groaned faintly under their weight, though the intruder seemed too intent on their task to notice. On the landing, the study door stood ajar. Through the gap, lantern light spilled across the hallway, warm yet unsettling. Tommy peered in. A figure knelt before the staircase wall, the very section Roach had repainted days before. A panel lay half removed at their side. The intruder's gloved hands worked quickly, stripping away the fresh green paint to reveal the paler undercoat beneath. Tuppence's breath caught. They're uncovering something Roach found. But at Tommy's whisper, the intruder froze. A hand shot out, extinguished the lantern, and the room plunged into darkness. "Stop!" Tommy shouted. A figure surged past them in a blur. Tuppence lunged, fingers grazing fabric, but the intruder tore free and fled down the stairs. Tommy followed, but by the time he reached the back door, it swung wildly in the night breeze, the intruder already swallowed by shadows beyond the hedgerow. For a moment, Tommy stood perfectly still, straining to hear footsteps. Nothing. He stepped back inside. Tuppence knelt before the partially stripped panel, her fingers hovering above the exposed surface. "Tommy, look." The paler paint beneath, cream-coloured, soft, old, bore faint outlines, angular, rectangular, embedded deep within the wall. "A compartment," Tommy murmured, "hidden deliberately." Exactly where Roach scratched the wall. He must have discovered it, or nearly. Tuppence reached out, tracing the outline carefully. And whoever was here tonight wanted to uncover it, or conceal it more thoroughly. Tommy crouched beside her. The paint was still tacky in places, scraped by a tool the intruder had evidently taken with them. "Roach died," he said quietly, "because he unearthed something buried years ago, something valuable enough to kill for." Tuppence nodded slowly. "Or dangerous enough." They examined the panel more closely. The rectangular shape was unmistakably man-made. Not a natural imperfection, but a deliberate storage cavity. Too small to hold anything large, but perfect for a letter, a document, perhaps a small box. Whatever it held, Tommy murmured, this is why the house was repainted. "To hide it," Tuppence said, and someone panicked when Roach found the hollow. A shiver of movement on the upper landing caught Tommy's attention. A soft, trembling voice followed. "You should not have seen that." Mrs. Vale stood at the top of the stairs, nightgown wrapped around her like a shroud, eyes wide with dread. She clutched the banister as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. Tuppence rose gently. "Mrs. Vale, someone has broken in, someone who knows exactly where to look." Mrs. Vale shook her head violently. "No, no, you do not understand. You must not open that panel." Tommy held up a reassuring hand. "We haven't touched it further." But Mrs. Vale descended the stairs, each step unsteady, her breath shallow. "I warned them," she whispered. "I warned them it should never be disturbed." "Who did you warn?" Tuppence pressed gently. Mrs. Vale's eyes glistened. "My husband knew. He knew what was inside that wall. He hid it. He painted over it himself. And when he died, he begged me never to reveal." Her voice cracked into silence. Tommy stepped closer. "Mrs. Vale, someone else knows now, someone dangerous." Tuppence added softly, "Edwin Roach died because this secret resurfaced. If we don't uncover the truth, someone else may suffer." Mrs. Vale looked from Tuppence to Tommy, then to the exposed outline in the wall. Her shoulders sagged. "You cannot know what harm the truth can do," she whispered. "Some truths ruin everything they touch." Tommy met her gaze steadily. "Some lies do the same." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, tears slipping down her cheeks, Mrs. Vale whispered one final sentence, one that deepened the mystery rather than illuminated it. "You should not have seen that, because now you will never be left in peace." A lantern flickered somewhere outside. A barge rope creaked in the night wind. And from the far ridge the train sounded again, a long, mournful note that seemed to echo the village's unspoken warning. Tommy and Tuppence stood beside the exposed panel, the weight of the hidden truth pressing in on all sides. Whatever lay inside that secret compartment, or whatever once had, was the heartbeat of the story. And now the village knew they were after it. Mrs. Vale had not slept. That much was obvious the next morning when she ushered Tommy and Tuppence into the parlour, with the stiff, mechanical movements of a woman who had paced the floorboards all night and spoken to ghosts. She gestured toward the sofa with a trembling hand but did not sit. Instead, she hovered, twisting a handkerchief until the thread strained. "I have decided," she said abruptly, "that some truth is better spoken than carried." Her voice cracked, as if unused to clarity. Tuppence leaned forward gently. "We're listening." Mrs. Vale pressed a hand to the wall beside the obscured painting, the place where the intruder had scraped away the paint. "My husband hid something there. A document. A confession he wrote himself." "Confession?" Tommy asked quietly. Mrs. Vale nodded, eyes distant. "He witnessed a terrible thing during the war, a crime committed here in the village. A young man was killed. My husband knew who did it, but he believed the act had been provoked, that revealing the truth would destroy a family already shattered by loss, so he wrote down what he had seen, sealed it, and hid it inside the wall." She swallowed. "He said it was only to be opened if the past forced its way forward again." Tuppence exchanged a cautious look with Tommy. "Did it?" Mrs. Vale sank into a chair, wringing her hands. "Years later, after the war, the house was repainted, pale cream, the colour you see beneath. Someone must have known about the confession. Someone must have been looking for it." Tommy asked, "Do you know who?" "No," she whispered. "But the blackmail letters began after that. Someone threatening to expose everything. I burned the letters. My husband had died by then, and I believe the confession lost with him." "But it wasn't?" Tuppence asked. Mrs. Vale gestured weakly toward the stripped panel. "Roach found it, or nearly did." Before they could ask more, a brisk rap sounded at the door. Mrs. Vale flinched. Tommy opened it to reveal Inspector Denham from the county town, a tall, bored-looking man who carried himself like someone annoyed to be disturbed from an early luncheon. "Morning," he said flatly. "Here, about your painter. Tragic business, of course. Drowning. Happens." Tuppence stepped forward. "Not when the man's boots are clean." Inspector Denham gave her a perfunctory glance, as though regarding a mildly irritating houseplant. Now, best not jump to conclusions." Tommy's tone remained cordial but firm. "A man drowned beside a muddy bank with spotless boots, suspicious scratches on a door nearby, and a village terrified of questions. You consider that accidental?" Denham straightened his tie. "Accidents often appear dramatic. Doesn't make them crimes." "Seldom makes them tidy either," Tuppence murmured. But Denham was already scribbling lazily in his notebook. "We'll classify it as misadventure. Painter took a fall. Sad, but not unheard of." Mrs. Vale's breath hitched. Tuppence turned sharply toward the inspector. "He was murdered, and if you refuse to see that, you may well let the killer strike again." Denham snapped his notebook shut. "Let's keep the theatrics to a minimum, shall we? This is not a London thriller." Then, nodding stiffly to Mrs. Vale, he added, "If you need anything, madam, don't hesitate to report. Good day." When the door closed behind him, Tuppence muttered, "If idiocy were an Olympic sport, he'd win gold." Tommy sighed. "Which means this is entirely ours, then." Mrs. Vale whispered, "Please, just leave it." But neither Beresford had ever done that, and they certainly weren't about to start. Outside, the village had shifted subtly. Children no longer played near the green. Curtains twitched more frequently. Doors clicked shut as Tommy and Tuppence walked past. There was no storm in the sky, yet one gathered socially, thick, pressurized, simmering. Tommy said, "We need corroboration about the reinforced wall." "The carpenter," Tuppence said. "He hinted last time that there was more to the story." They found him repairing a bench near the church. He looked up warily when they approached. "We have more questions," Tommy said mildly. "I reckoned you would," the carpenter replied, putting aside his tools. "About the wall?" Tuppence nodded. "You said Mr. Vale had it reinforced during the war." "Right. He didn't want anyone tampering with that part of the house. Said the plaster was fragile." He paused. "But it wasn't fragile. I checked. It was hollow. He boarded it up tighter than a bank safe." Tommy asked, "And he didn't want you to ask why?" "Not at all. Paid me extra precisely so I wouldn't." Tuppence leaned in. "Has anyone else asked you about that wall?" The carpenter hesitated, visibly torn. Then he sighed. "Edwin Roach, a week ago. Said he'd heard something when sanding, hollow, like there was something behind there. Did he mention anyone warning him off? The carpenter hesitated again. Mrs. Hawthorne told him not to dig where he didn't intend to find snakes. Tuppence raised an eyebrow. Snakes? He shrugged, her manner of speaking, but she looked troubled. Tommy and Tuppence exchanged a look. Two names now threaded through every whisper, Linton and Hawthorne. Back at Mrs. Vale's house, Tuppence knelt before the stripped section of wall to inspect the faint outline of the hidden cavity. Under the pale cream paint, something glimmered faintly, residue of another layer. She brought her face closer. Tommy, look at this. He crouched beside her, a red smear. The same colour we found on Roach's brush. She scraped lightly at the paint with her nail. Someone painted over this section in a hurry. The brushstrokes are uneven. So the killer, Tommy said, broke in before last night, pried at the wall, found something, or feared Roach had, then sealed it back up in haste. Tuppence nodded. And perhaps Roach caught them in the act, or discovered the evidence of their handiwork. They spent another 10 minutes inspecting the panel. Nothing else seemed disturbed, but the red streak spoke clearly enough. Someone had concealed the secret compartment not once but twice. Behind them, Mrs. Vale watched nervously from the sofa. Tuppence turned to her gently. Mrs. Vale, you said the confession was destroyed. Are you certain? Mrs. Vale looked exhausted. I burned the letters from the blackmailer. But the confession, my husband sealed it and hid it himself. He told me he would find a safer place later, but he died before he did. So it may still be in the wall, Tommy said. Or it may have been taken, Tuppence murmured, by someone who broke in before the repainting. Someone who wanted to control the narrative. Mrs. Vale closed her eyes, her face drawn. This village has long memories, sometimes too long. After leaving her, Tommy and Tuppence walked the towpath again. It was late afternoon. The canal wore a reflective sheen like polished stone. A flock of geese drifted lazily, utterly indifferent to human intrigue. Tuppence folded her arms. We have 3 suspects. Tommy nodded. Mr. Linton, the man with nighttime habits and a quick temper. And Mrs. Hawthorne, Tuppence added, whose brother was involved in the old wartime case. And Mrs. Vale herself, Tommy concluded reluctantly, because fear can masquerade as innocence, and sometimes guilt lives beneath the trembling. But she seems genuinely fragile, Tuppence said softly. Truth doesn't preclude fragility. Tuppence sighed. And yet, something tells me she hides fear rather than deeds. They paused as the sound of a door latch caught their attention. A woman down the lane, one they had passed earlier, quickly drew her child inside, eyes darting toward them as though they carried contagion. The village is sealing itself, Tuppence whispered. Tommy nodded. This is what happens when a secret cracks open. People fear being the next piece to fall. Which is why the killer is growing desperate, Tuppence said. A barge engine rumbled behind them. Mr. Linton guided his vessel toward its mooring with slow, deliberate movements. He did not look at them, which was, in its own way, more telling than if he had stared. Tuppence said quietly, He's protecting something. Or someone. Or himself. Tommy nudged her lightly. You've grown pessimistic. I've grown observant. They continued toward the inn, passing the pub window where Mrs. Hawthorne stood polishing glasses with a furrowed brow. For a moment she looked out, but dropped her gaze quickly, as if eye contact carried consequence. Tuppence murmured, She's afraid. Tommy responded, But of what? The truth, or the unravelling of a lie she helped maintain? Inside the pub, 2 men whispered rapidly before falling silent when the Beresfords entered. A dog that had been lounging beneath a table whimpered and crawled beneath its owner's legs. Mrs. Hawthorne approached stiffly. We're closing early, she said. Tuppence replied, It's barely 6. Village business, Mrs. Hawthorne rasped. Best you return to London soon. Tommy smiled politely. Not until this matter is resolved. Mrs. Hawthorne's hand tightened around her cloth. Some matters don't want resolving. Before Tuppence could answer, a man from the back called sharply, Hawthorne, come here. She vanished through the curtain, leaving Tommy and Tuppence alone. Tommy exhaled slowly. We're standing on fault lines. And the ground is starting to shift beneath us, Tuppence said. They stepped outside again, where the evening had deepened into a muted chorus of distant voices, closing shutters, and the occasional thud of a bolt being drawn into place. Not one villager greeted them. Not one child lingered outside. The canal itself seemed to hold its voice. Tuppence said quietly, "Whatever is in that compartment, or was, is what ties them all together." Tommy nodded gravely. "And whoever took it knows the village is close to breaking. Fear breeds rash decisions." "And rash decisions lead to bodies," Tuppence murmured. A lantern flickered in Mrs. Vale's window. A barge rope creaked. A whisper passed between two unseen figures. The tension in Little Wyvern did not rise like a storm from the sky. It rose from beneath the ground, from between the stones of the towpath, from the walls whose paint hid histories no one wished to confront. And somewhere among these whispers lived a killer, one who had already struck once. Tommy met Tuppence's gaze. "We need to be quicker," he said. She nodded. "Because they are getting bolder." And the social storm, quiet, watchful, suffocating, closed in around them. The Red Wyvern Inn looked unchanged from the outside, shutters half open, signs swaying gently, a curl of smoke drifting from the chimney. Yet when Tommy stepped inside that morning, the air felt charged, the kind of tense stillness found in rooms where arguments had recently occurred and where no one wished to admit it. Mrs. Hawthorne glanced up sharply from wiping the counter. "We're not open." Tommy smiled politely. "I only need a quiet word. No drink required." "Then you'll get no cheer from me," she muttered. "Fortunately," Tommy said, "I didn't come for cheer." She frowned, pausing mid-wipe. "Then what?" Edwin Roach's belongings. A flicker, unmistakable. "What of them?" "I was told he sometimes kept notebooks here. Sketches. Observations." Mrs. Hawthorne stiffened. "I've nothing of his." Tommy looked around the room. A painter with no sketches? Unlikely. She resumed wiping as though scrubbing away her own discomfort. "Even if he left anything, it's mine now, and I don't hand keepsakes to strangers." "Mrs. Hawthorne," Tommy said gently, "someone killed Roach, and they may well kill again, if he recorded anything dangerous." Her eyes flashed. "Everything in this village is dangerous if put in the wrong hands." Tommy let the silence linger. Then calmly he rested his hand on the bar. "Let me ask differently. Did Roach ever draw this house?" He slid a small photograph of Mrs. Vale's greenhouse toward her. Mrs. Hawthorne's breath halted. A beat. Then, with a curt motion, she vanished into the back room. Tommy waited, patient, still, listening. He caught snippets, drawers sliding, fabric rustling, a faint grunt of annoyance. When she returned, she carried a thin, battered sketchbook tied with twine. She placed it on the bar but held one corner with her fingers. "I'm not doing this for you," she said. "I'm doing it because whatever started with that house is about to boil over, and I don't want to see this village tear itself apart." Tommy inclined his head. "A noble sentiment." "Don't make it sound like I'm joining the Salvation Army," she snapped, releasing the book. "Take it, and be careful who sees you with it." Tommy thanked her, tucked the sketchbook safely inside his coat, and slipped out before any lingering patrons could ask questions. He met Tuppence at the stone bridge. She was leaning on the railing, watching the slow sweep of sunlight glimmer across the canal surface. "Well?" she asked. Tommy showed her the sketchbook. Her eyebrows rose. "Tommy Beresford, you triumph again." "I occasionally perform well under pressure." "You always perform well under pressure," she corrected. They settled on a bench beneath the bridge arch. Tommy untied the twine, and they opened the sketchbook together. Roach's sketches were raw, rapid, almost frantic. Lines slashed across the paper as though drawn in haste or with heightened nerves. Each drawing bore a date in the corner. The first few showed nothing unusual. The canal house, scaffolding, the front steps, the ladder. But then came the later sketches. A shift in tone, darker shading, stronger strokes. Tuppence pointed. "Look here. The house again, but the staircase panel. He's drawn it taller than in real life." "Exaggeration?" Tommy asked. "Or emphasis," Tuppence said. He wanted to draw attention to that wall, as if it mattered. They turned the page. A night scene. The house under moonlight. A faint outline of someone crouched beside the towpath. Another page. The same location, but this time a second figure behind the first. Little more than a shadowy suggestion, but undeniably present. The next drawing was more chilling still, a figure leaning over what appeared to be a bundle or object in the reeds. The sketch was rough, but the urgency leapt from the page. Tuppence inhaled sharply. Roach saw something. Or someone, Tommy said quietly. A meeting near the water, perhaps tied to the wartime secret. And the second figure? Tuppence asked. The one in the background. Tommy traced the faint lines with his thumb. The watcher, or the accomplice, or the killer. Tuppence closed the book briefly, steadying herself. This proves Roach witnessed a clandestine moment, maybe one that echoed the crime from years ago. Tommy nodded, and he was silenced because he sketched it. Tuppence reopened the book. But we still don't know what he nearly uncovered behind the panel. A shout broke the quiet. On the lane above the canal, Mrs. Hawthorne stormed toward Mr. Linton, who stood beside his barge coiling rope. Her voice rang clear in the still air. "You had no right," she snapped, "talking to them like you've got nothing to hide." Linton stepped forward, face reddening. "Better than you, running your mouth when you should keep it shut." "You think I don't know what you were doing that night?" Mrs. Hawthorne hissed. Linton's jaw tightened. "You know nothing." "Enough," she retorted. "Enough to ruin you if I wished." "If you wished?" Linton echoed mockingly. "But you won't, because if I go down, you'll go with me." Mrs. Hawthorne froze. Tuppence's eyes widened slightly. "Well, that's illuminating," Tommy whispered. "Neither seems guilty, but they're both afraid." "And fear makes people irrational," Tuppence murmured. "That argument was desperation, not guilt." They watched until the two retreated in opposite directions, each wearing an expression of frayed nerves. Tuppence closed the sketchbook. "We need to move. If the killer learns the sketches survived, they might panic." Tommy nodded. "And panic leads to mistakes." "Or violence," Tuppence added. That night, a nervous hush settled over Little Wyvern. Doors shut earlier. Lamps dimmed behind curtains. A sense of vigilance clung to the air. Tommy and Tuppence approached Mrs. Vale's house cautiously. The moon cast long silver streaks across the canal. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, abruptly silenced. Inside the house Mrs. Vale had retired early again, but she left a lamp glowing in the hallway. The Beresfords stood in the parlour examining the stripped wall, the pale undercoat exposed beneath jagged lines where the intruder had scraped. The outline of the hidden compartment was clearer now, rectangular, narrow, deep. "We have to open it," Tuppence whispered. Tommy nodded. "But carefully. If the intruder returns—" Before he could finish, a faint noise drifted from upstairs. A footstep, then another. Tuppence's breath stilled. "Tommy, someone's in the house." The lights flickered. A shadow passed the staircase landing. Tommy gestured for silence. They moved with quiet precision, slipping behind the drawing-room doorway. A slow creak sounded from the study above. Tuppence whispered, "They're searching again. Or retrieving something they believe we've seen." A second shadow moved on the landing, fast, purposeful. The intruder descended halfway down the stairs, stopped abruptly as though sensing presence, then darted back up. Tommy bolted for the stairs. "Now!" The intruder, swift and agile, raced toward the back corridor. Tommy pursued, but a window slammed, the sharp sound of escape. When he reached the corridor, the window was open wide, curtains fluttering. Outside, the garden shrubs quivered, branches snapping faintly as someone fled toward the canal. Tuppence burst in behind him. "Did you see their face?" "No," Tommy said, leaning out. "But they went toward the water." "And they were prepared," Tuppence said grimly. "Too fast for coincidence." They returned to the parlour to inspect the wall again. Something was different. Tuppence gasped. "Tommy, look!" A small metal edge protruded from the cavity, barely visible but unmistakable. Tommy reached in carefully, fingers grazing cool metal. "A box," he murmured, "thin, like a document case." Tuppence held her breath as he worked it loose. The metal resisted at first, wedged deep, but finally gave way. Tommy pulled out a flat, rust-edged case coated in flakes of dried plaster. They set it on the table. Tuppence wiped away dust until the dull lid shone faintly. Inside lay a single sealed envelope, the paper yellowed with age. Tuppence read the handwriting aloud. "For Imogen, and for truth, if truth ever becomes necessary. Thomas Vale, Mrs. Vale's late husband. Tuppence looked up, eyes bright with the gravity of the moment. "This is the confession." Tommy nodded, voice low. "The reason Roach died, and the reason someone keeps breaking in." He lifted the envelope. The seal was brittle, cracking slightly at the edges. The weight of decades rested upon it. A sound came from the landing, the unmistakable intake of breath. Mrs. Vale stood at the top of the stairs, hand against her heart, eyes enormous. "No," she whispered. "No, you found it." Tuppence stepped forward. "Mrs. Vale, this is your husband's confession. It may explain everything." Mrs. Vale clutched the banister. "You don't understand. If you read that—" "We must," Tommy said gently but firmly. She shook her head violently. "You don't know the consequences." Tuppence glanced at Tommy, then back at Mrs. Vale. "People are already suffering consequences. Edwin Roach is dead. Someone tried twice to break in. The truth is already tearing your village apart." Mrs. Vale closed her eyes. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "He wanted it kept hidden, for my sake." "And look what hiding it has done," Tuppence said softly. Mrs. Vale swayed and then slowly descended the stairs. "Read it," she whispered. "If you must, read it." Tommy broke the seal. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. The ink had faded but remained legible. He read aloud. "On the night of March the 4th, 1943, I witnessed a murder on the Canal towpath. The victim, a young man named Henry Corley, died by a blow to the head. The killer was not a stranger. It was someone from this village. I concealed the truth because I believed the act born of fear, not cruelty. But that concealment has weighed upon me, and if it should return to haunt this village, let this be the record that I, Thomas Vale, knew the truth and hid it." Tommy paused. Mrs. Vale trembled. Tuppence touched her hand. "Who was the killer?" Mrs. Vale shook her head, but not in denial, in memory and fear. "Someone," she whispered, "who still lives among us." Tuppence and Tommy exchanged a look heavy with the knowledge that everything had now shifted. The secret was no longer abstract. It was real, tangible, lethal. Tommy folded the letter carefully. "This changes everything." "Yes," Mrs. Vale whispered. "And now that you know, the danger becomes real for you as well." A lantern flickered outside. A rope creaked across a mooring post. A figure moved in the distance, watching. The truth had left the wall, and someone intended to bury it again, even if it required another grave. In the silence that followed Tommy's reading of the confession letter, no one spoke at first. Even the house felt silent, as though its walls, so long stuffed with secrets, were listening to the final unravelling of their burden. Tuppence broke the silence first. "Mrs. Vale, the person mentioned in this confession, the one your husband saw, do you know who it was?" Mrs. Vale closed her eyes. "I know," she whispered, "all too well." Tommy stepped gently toward her. "Please understand, we're not here to cause harm, but we must know the truth if we're to protect you and others." Mrs. Vale's breath trembled. The woman was not a stranger. She was not someone passing through. She lived here, grew up here, married here. Her fingers tightened on the banister, and she had been desperate, so terribly desperate. Tuppence pressed softly. "Who was she?" Mrs. Vale shook her head. "Before I answer, you need to understand the night it happened." She sank into a chair, and with a heaviness that seemed to press the air down around her, she spoke. "It was 1943, Mrs. Vale murmured. Air raid warnings had become routine. My husband and I were halfway down the towpath after a village meeting when we heard a noise near the reeds. A struggle, a cry, and then a splash." Her voice wavered. "A young man, Henry Corley, had been struck down, and the woman standing over him was someone we knew, someone the village admired, someone who later vanished into marriage and respectability." Tuppence felt a shiver. "Who?" Mrs. Vale's throat tightened. "She believed Henry meant to attack her. My husband found them moments after the blow. She was terrified, begged him to protect her. He did." She looked at the confession letter with a mixture of grief and resignation. "Until the day he died, it tormented him." Tommy folded his arms, his tone gentle but firm. "Which woman, Mrs. Vale?" Her shoulders trembled. Then, in a voice barely audible, she said, "It was me." Tuppence froze. Even Tommy, trained in concealment of shock, blinked. Mrs. Vale gave a broken laugh. "You see? It sounds absurd now, but I was young, foolish, frightened. Henry and I—" her voice faltered. "He had been drinking. He said things, threatened things. I defended myself. The blow was lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you see it." Her eyes filled with tears. "My husband found me holding the weapon. I was hysterical. He took control. He told me to go home. He said he would deal with everything." "And he hid the truth," Tommy said softly. "To protect me." Her voice cracked. "He strengthened the wall, hid the letter there, told me to continue on with my life, with my marriage, with my silence." Tuppence knelt beside her, and someone discovered the secret. Mrs. Vale nodded slowly. "The letters started 3 years ago, anonymous, threatening to reveal everything. I tried to ignore them. Then they stopped, until recently, when the house was repainted." "Roach discovered the compartment," Tommy said, "or enough evidence of it." "And someone killed him," Tuppence murmured. "Someone afraid the confession would surface." Mrs. Vale covered her face with trembling hands. "I never wanted anyone hurt. Never." Tuppence held her hand briefly, offering quiet reassurance before rising. Tommy looked at the confession letter again. Someone knew what was in that wall, or suspected. Someone terrified the truth would shatter their place in this village. Tuppence exhaled. "And we now must determine whose life would crumble if Mrs. Vale's decades-old secret came out." Back at the inn, Tommy and Tuppence sat at a corner table, the confession letter between them. Tuppence tapped it thoughtfully. "So now we know the identity of the woman and the motive for hiding the murder, but we still don't know the blackmailer or the killer." Tommy nodded. "Let's list villagers of the right age. The blackmailer must be someone who either knew Henry Corley or discovered the secret through gossip, observation, or Roach's discoveries." Tuppence made notes. "Mrs. Hawthorne," she began. "Right age, deep roots in the village, and she's concealing a great deal behind her bluster." "And she admitted her brother was involved in something wartime-related," Tommy added. "Then Mr. Linton," Tuppence said. "He's constantly on the canal. Roach sketched someone wearing a coat like his." Tommy frowned. "But his anger seems more about secrecy than fear. And that argument with Mrs. Hawthorne today, desperation perhaps, but not guilt." Tuppence leaned back. "And then there's Mrs. Vale herself." Tommy hesitated. "But she already confessed her involvement." "Yes," Tuppence said, "but involvement in a wartime tragedy does not preclude involvement now. Trauma can twist motives." Tommy's expression darkened. "Even so, I don't sense murderous intent from her. She's too frightened, too frail." Tuppence nodded reluctantly. "Agreed. But the blackmailer, someone else who learnt the secret, could be anyone." "Anyone except the victims and the dead," Tommy murmured. "And the desperate," Tuppence added, "tend to reveal themselves sooner rather than later." Back in their room, Tommy reopened Roach's sketchbook. "Let's look again," he said. "Fresh eyes." The sketches of the staircase panel loomed large. Tuppence traced the exaggerated height in the drawings. He wanted to emphasize it. He must have sensed something hollow or hidden. Tommy nodded. "Or saw evidence of tampering." They turned again to the night sketch, the one showing a figure leaning over the canal edge, with another shadow behind. Tommy studied the shape of the coat. Long, heavy, the hemline flares slightly. Tuppence frowned. "Like Mr. Linton's." "Possibly," Tommy agreed, "but look closely." He pointed to the footwear, just faintly outlined but clear enough. "These boots," Tommy murmured, "aren't barge boots. They're heeled, narrower." Tuppence's eyes widened. "A woman's boots." "Precisely." They exchanged a long, tense look. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Tuppence whispered. "Or," Tommy said slowly, "another woman altogether." Tuppence stiffened. "Mrs. Vale?" Tommy shook his head. "No, she was at home the night Roach died." "Then who?" Tommy closed the sketchbook softly. "That is the question that matters." Outside, the village felt altered. People walked in pairs instead of alone. Lamps were lit earlier. Conversations ended abruptly when strangers approached. A palpable unease threaded through the air like smoke. Tommy and Tuppence stepped outside the inn just in time to see Mrs. Hawthorne hurrying across the lane, head down, posture tense. Behind her, Mr. Linton emerged from an alley, watching her with narrowed eyes. Tuppence whispered, "Another confrontation brewing." They followed discreetly. Mrs. Hawthorne spun at the sound of approaching footsteps. Not theirs, but Linton's. "You again," she snapped. "You've been talking," Linton hissed, "telling them things." Mrs. Hawthorne's chin lifted. "Better to talk than kill." "Watch your words," Linton growled. "Roach fell because he—" "Roach was murdered," she said sharply. "And you know it." Linton glared. "You think I'd kill a man? Me?" Mrs. Hawthorne hesitated. I don't know anymore." "And neither do I," Linton shot back, his voice breaking with something like frustration. The two parted abruptly, walking away in opposite directions, leaving behind a trail of tension that clung to the lane like fog. Tuppence whispered, "Neither of them is the killer." Tommy nodded. "But both know more than they dare say, and both are terrified." Night descended quietly, too quietly. The canal reflected the moonlight like a cold blade. The air was still, heavy with anticipation. Tuppence paced the floor of Mrs. Vale's parlour while Tommy stood guard near the staircase panel. "It's too quiet," Tuppence murmured, "as if the village is holding its breath." Tommy nodded. "When people grow fearful, they retreat. But the killer—" A faint sound cut him off. Glass rattling, a window shifting. Tommy turned. "They're here." Tuppence's pulse quickened. Again. They moved swiftly toward the back corridor. A silhouette darted past, a figure quick, agile, and cloaked. Tommy lunged, but the intruder slipped through his grasp like smoke. "Stop!" Tuppence called, racing behind. The figure fled through the garden, feet barely touching the soil, and vaulted over the hedge with practiced ease. A splash followed, someone entering a moored boat or the canal itself. Tommy reached the hedge too late. The night swallowed the intruder. Tuppence, breathless, returned to the parlour. What did they take, or leave? Tommy knelt beside the panel and froze. "Tuppence," he said slowly, "look." The metal case still lay on the floor, but the edges were now clean, free of dust and plaster, as though someone had handled it or checked its contents. Tuppence crouched beside him. "The envelope is still inside." Tommy lifted it. "Yes, but something was different." Tuppence frowned. "The seal, it's been broken." Tommy checked the contents. "No, the letter is untouched, but someone opened it before we found them." "Or before we arrived tonight," Tuppence murmured. She inspected the interior of the compartment. "Anything else in here? Any other documents?" Tommy shook his head. "Just the confession." "Then the intruder didn't come to retrieve it," Tuppence said. "They came to confirm whether it was still there." "Which means," Tommy murmured, "they're planning their next move." Mrs. Vale staggered into the room again, drawn by the commotion. "Please, what now?" Tuppence guided her gently to a chair. "Someone attempted to enter again. They may know we found the confession." Mrs. Vale's eyes glistened with fear. "I never wanted this. I never wanted any of this to resurface." "We know," Tommy said kindly, "but it's too late to push it back into the wall." Tuppence added, "We have to determine who sent the anonymous letter to us, and why." Mrs. Vale hesitated. Then, trembling, she said, "I received a letter myself a week ago, before you arrived." Tommy leaned in. "What did it say?" Mrs. Vale stared at the floor. "That I had one last chance to confess, and if I didn't, others would die." Tuppence froze. "Others? Not just Roach?" Mrs. Vale nodded slowly. "Others. Plural." Tommy's expression tightened. So the blackmailer expected us to come and wanted the village shaken. Tuppence whispered, "To flush out someone." "Or to push someone into panic," Tommy added. Back at the inn, Tommy re-examined the sketch depicting the night scene. "Tuppence, look here again." She leaned closer. The figure behind the crouched person, only faintly drawn, had a distinctive line to the coat collar, a double-notch fold. "Tommy, those aren't women's boots after all." Tommy nodded. "Look at the coat too. It's long, yes, but military style." Not Linton, Tuppence murmured. Military clothing. Wartime. Someone older now. They exchanged a glance of startling clarity. The brother, Tuppence whispered. Mrs. Hawthorne's brother. The one she said was involved in the wartime case. And the one no one ever seems to mention by name, Tommy said quietly, because he left or stayed hidden. If he returned, Tuppence continued, he'd know the truth. He might want to expose Mrs. Vale or punish the village or twist the secret for his own advantage. Tommy nodded grimly. We need to find him. But they didn't have to find him, because by morning the village woke to unsettling news. A villager had vanished. Not Mr. Linton, not Mrs. Hawthorne, but the elderly gardener, the quiet man who had pruned roses and spoken in whispers. Gone. His home empty. His belongings undisturbed. His tools sitting neatly outside the church. Tuppence stood beside Tommy as the villagers whispered in frightened clusters. Tommy murmured, He was the one who told us about the blackmail letters. And he's the only one who spoke openly about the past, Tuppence said. They looked at each other. Someone, Tuppence whispered, is cleaning up loose ends. And the canal, Tommy said grimly, tends to hide ghosts only for so long. The village was now in full dread, and the killer was accelerating. Tommy spread the confession letter, Roach's sketchbook, and their accumulated notes across the small table in their inn-room. The morning light streamed through the narrow window, illuminating every crease in the paper and every anxious line on Tuppence's face. She stood beside him, arms folded, brow furrowed in concentration. Everything we need is here, Tommy murmured. We simply have to read it correctly. Tuppence tapped the sketchbook. Roach saw something, and someone, a meeting by the canal, a watcher behind the figure near the reeds. But he didn't just sketch the event. He sketched details he must have wanted us to notice. Tommy nodded. Such as? The staircase panel, Tuppence said, the exaggerated height. He emphasized it repeatedly as though saying, look here, look here. That's how he found the compartment. And the figure in the long coat, Tommy added. Possibly a man at first glance, but the boots tell a different story. Right, Tuppence said. Heeled, slight taper, a woman's boots. Tommy leaned back in his chair. Which brings us here, to motive. Who knew about the hidden compartment? Who knew Mrs. Vale feared discovery? Who knew the house intimately? Tuppence's eyes sharpened. And who had access to red paint, the same shade we found smeared near the panel? Tommy turned his chair toward her. Exactly. They exchanged a slow, meaningful look. Mrs. Hawthorne, her evasiveness, her anger, her conflict with Linton, her knowledge of the village's wartime past, her earlier comment, I once repainted that house myself to keep it looking decent. Tuppence inhaled sharply. Tommy, if she repainted the house years ago, she would have discovered the reinforced panel, maybe even suspected something was hidden there. More importantly, Tommy said, only someone working in the pub would have access to red primer. Tuppence nodded. And she handled barrels every day. She marks them with chalk symbols for stock rotation. Tommy reached for the sketchbook. He flipped to the final drawing, the most hurried, frantic, and telling one. Here, he said, pointing, near the base of the figure's boot, a small chalk line. Roach wasn't drawing the ground, he was drawing her mark. Tuppence leaned in. Her chalk mark. Tommy closed the book softly. Roach confronted her, or hinted that he knew something. And she panicked, Tuppence finished, and killed him. A pause followed, heavy, inevitable. They knew. They finally knew. The towpath felt colder today, though the sky was clear and still. A faint ripple of dread moved across the water, as though the canal itself sensed the truth forming around Tommy and Tuppence. Tuppence crouched near the reeds where Roach's brush had been found. She held it in her hands again, the streak of dried red paint glinting faintly. Why use red primer? She murmured. Because, Tommy said, stepping beside her, she didn't expect anyone to look closely, and primer is easier to disguise under a final coat. Tuppence sighed. She wasn't thinking clearly. Murderers rarely do. Footsteps echoed behind them. Mrs. Hawthorne approached, arms stiff, jaw set in her usual expression of annoyed suspicion. Still poking about? She demanded. Haven't you bothered the village enough? Tuppence straightened, slipping the brush into her pocket. "We're getting close," Mrs. Hawthorne snorted. "Close to what? A conspiracy made of dust and imagination?" Tommy looked at her calmly. "Close to truth, and truth tends to seep through cracks, even through layers of paint." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Careful, Mr. Tommy." He offered her a mild smile. "We're always careful, especially when people begin issuing warnings." Mrs. Hawthorne glared at him, then stalked away, muttering something under her breath. Tuppence murmured, "She's fraying. The more we press, the more the mask slips." "And frayed masks," Tommy replied, "tend to tear." They waited until the noon rush died down before approaching the Red Wyvern's side yard. The storage shed sat tucked behind the building, its door slightly ajar. A faint smell of turpentine and primer drifted out. Tuppence stepped inside first. Barrels lined the walls, arranged neatly with coloured chalk marks on each, sprigs drawn on some, slashes on others, triangles on a few. Tommy knelt near one barrel, tracing a chalk mark with his finger. "Look familiar?" Tuppence's eyes widened. "The exact symbol from Roach's sketch." Tommy nodded. This is what he was trying to convey. He didn't draw a meaningless smudge, he drew a symbol. Hers. Tuppence walked further inside, noticing a can of red primer tucked behind crates. She lifted it. "Same shade," she murmured. Tommy's expression hardened. "Roach came in here. He must have seen something, or found her hiding something." "Such as the tool she used to pry open the panel," Tuppence said, "or the coat she wore that night." They heard footsteps approaching. Tommy extinguished the lantern they'd brought. Tuppence whispered, "Hide." They slipped behind the stacked barrels just as the shed door creaked open. Someone entered quietly, carefully, too carefully. Mrs. Hawthorne. Her silhouette moved across the faint sliver of daylight. She crossed to the back of the shed, lifted the red paint tin, and checked its lid. Then she reached behind a crate and withdrew something wrapped in cloth. Tommy squinted, breath held. A coat, long, heavy, with a distinctive flare at the hem. Tuppence's eyes widened. She clutched Tommy's arm lightly, not in fear, but as confirmation. Mrs. Hawthorne tucked the coat under her arm and turned to leave. Before she stepped outside, she paused as though sensing something amiss. She scanned the shed, slowly, methodically. Then she left. Tommy exhaled softly. "It's her." Tuppence nodded. The final coat of paint and the final coat of clothing. Returning to Mrs. Vale's house, they found her seated by the window, watching the canal as though expecting her past to rise from it like mist. Tuppence sat beside her. "Mrs. Vale, we need to ask something difficult." Mrs. Vale turned, weary-eyed. "I imagine everything now will be difficult." "Your friend," Tuppence said gently. "Mrs. Hawthorne, how close were you during the wartime years?" Mrs. Vale's expression softened with memory. "We were inseparable once. She was my confidant, my shield when I felt frightened. She helped me hide the truth." Tommy added, "She also helped your husband conceal evidence." Mrs. Vale's breath caught. "She insisted on helping him paint the house. She said the wartime gossip was too dangerous and needed covering." Tuppence exchanged a glance with Tommy. "She knew about the compartment." Mrs. Vale stared ahead. I suppose she must have." "And she feared," Tommy said, "that if your confession resurfaced, her role in the cover-up would come out as well." Mrs. Vale trembled. "She always said secrets are shared burdens, but they become chains." Tuppence squeezed her hand. "She's frightened, and frightened people do terrible things." Mrs. Vale's voice fell to a whisper. "You cannot know how frightening shared guilt can be." Tommy stood. "We do, actually. We see it in every case." He looked at Tuppence. "It's time," he said. The inn's cellar smelled of damp stone, oak barrels, and faint traces of ale. Tuppence didn't announce her arrival. She simply descended the stairs and closed the door behind her. Mrs. Hawthorne was there, drawing ale from a cask. Her movements were stiff, agitated, like someone fighting tremors beneath their skin. Without looking up, she said, "If you've come to order a drink, the bar's upstairs." Tuppence stepped further into the dim light. "I haven't." Mrs. Hawthorne straightened slowly, then spit it out. Tuppence held the sketchbook up. "Roach saw you on the towpath. He saw you with someone, and he saw you again later." Mrs. Hawthorne's jaw clenched. Tuppence continued, her voice calm but deliberate. "He drew your chalk mark, a symbol you use only here. He must have confronted you, or implied he knew what you were hiding. Mrs. Hawthorne slammed the ale tap shut. Ridiculous. Your coat is still in the shed, Tuppence said. The one you wore that night. Mrs. Hawthorne paled. Tuppence stepped closer. You feared the confession would expose Mrs. Vale, and you along with her. You helped hide the crime. Your silence became your prison. Mrs. Hawthorne laughed, a sound brittle and breaking. You think I killed him out of fear? You think fear is enough? Not fear alone, Tuppence said. Loyalty and guilt. You covered up a crime for your best friend. You repainted the evidence, you carried her burden. But when Roach scratched the truth back into daylight, you panicked. Mrs. Hawthorne's hands trembled. I tried to warn him, told him not to meddle. He threatened to tell the inspector, said he'd earn a fortune selling the story to the papers. Her voice cracked. I pushed him. It was supposed to scare him. He slipped, hit his head near the lock. And then, Tuppence said quietly, you painted over the evidence. Mrs. Hawthorne swallowed, chin quivering. I didn't mean to kill him. I only meant to protect her. Everything spiraled. I lost control. Tuppence reached out her hand. You need to stop running. Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes glistened with grief. Don't you understand? If her secret comes out, she'll break. And I couldn't bear to watch her crumble. Secrets break people far more than truth, Tuppence said gently. Mrs. Hawthorne suddenly bolted, pushing past Tuppence, scrambling for the cellar steps. Tuppence followed, calling, Stop, please! Mrs. Hawthorne burst into the lane, coat flapping wildly around her arm. She sprinted toward the canal path, breath ragged, eyes wild with desperation. Tommy stepped out from behind a corner and blocked her way. She skidded to a halt, staring at him. Tommy spoke softly. It's over. No, she whispered brokenly. It's never been over. Her knees buckled beneath her. The coat fell from her hands. She sank onto the grass, sobbing. The inspector, summoned earlier by Tommy, stepped forward from the shadows with 2 constables. He placed a hand on Mrs. Hawthorne's shoulder. I'm afraid you must come with us, he said gently. Mrs. Hawthorne didn't resist. She simply wept. Later, Tuppence sat beside Mrs. Vale on her parlour sofa. The older woman stared at the wall where the panel had been stripped, the wall that had held her husband's confession for decades. She did it for me, Mrs. Vale whispered, voice thin. She carried my sin longer than anyone should bear. Tuppence took her hand gently. She cared for you deeply, but protection born of guilt becomes a cage. Mrs. Vale nodded weakly. And now she'll pay the price. Tommy joined them. The inspector believes the court will recognize Roach's death as unintentional manslaughter. Her cooperation will help. Mrs. Vale closed her eyes. Nothing will help her heart. Tuppence spoke softly. Some ghosts linger because no one gives them permission to leave. Mrs. Vale looked at her. I never meant for any of this. Tommy nodded. Secrets grow heavier with time. They always do. Tuppence added quietly, but truth, once spoken, lets the air in. Mrs. Vale reached for the confession letter, folded gently on her lap. My husband wanted the truth to surface some day. He must have known what secrecy was doing to us all. Tommy smiled faintly. He trusted that when the time came, someone sensible would be here to handle it. Tuppence patted his knee, meaning us. Mrs. Vale managed a small, grateful smile. Outside, the canal glimmered with a rare sense of peace, as though relieved its ghosts had finally surfaced, acknowledged at last. The village would heal, slowly, painfully, but honestly. The truth had been painted over too many times. Now, at last, it was allowed to dry in the open air. It was curious how quickly a village could soften once the truth settled. Not immediately. No truth ever worked quite so magically. But in Little Wyvern the air felt lighter only 2 days after Mrs. Hawthorne's arrest. People moved with less furtiveness. Doors remained open longer. Even the towpath, once tense with unspoken dread, now carried the easy rhythm of everyday footsteps. Whispers persisted, of course, but they echoed differently, no longer sharp with suspicion, but rounder, shaped by reflection. Tuppence noticed these shifts as she and Tommy walked toward Mrs. Vale's house for one last visit. The green paint still clung to the walls, but scaffolding had been erected once again, and new tins of pale cream paint waited in the garden. A colour soft as morning light, Tommy thought, and infinitely more hopeful. Mrs. Vale greeted them at the door, thinner than before but steadier. "I've decided," she said, gesturing toward the house, "that it should return to how it was. It seems the only honest thing to do." Tuppence smiled warmly. "It's a beautiful colour, very gentle." Mrs. Vale nodded. "My husband loved it. He said cream reflected the canal better than any other shade. A house should own its place, he told me once." Her eyes glistened with memory, but for the first time they were not heavy with guilt. "Thank you both, for everything. I'm not sure I deserve such kindness." Tommy replied simply, "Kindness isn't about deserving. It's about putting the world slightly to rights." Mrs. Vale reached out and squeezed his hand, then Tuppence's. "You've given me the chance to breathe again. I hope the village will heal." "It will," Tuppence said softly. "Truth doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it clears space for something new." Mrs. Vale's gaze drifted toward the canal. "Perhaps." After farewells, the Beresfords made their way to the towpath, walking without urgency, watching the ripples glide across the water. A barge drifted past, its captain raising a lazy hand in greeting. Even Mr. Linton, now freed of suspicion, gave them a curt but respectful nod. Tommy chuckled. A slight improvement in attitude. "I dare say even bargemen appreciate crime-solving now and then," Tuppence replied lightly. They paused near the stone bridge, where sketches had led them, where clues had surfaced, and where shadows had once moved with danger. Now the only movement was sunlight trembling on the surface of the canal. Tuppence exhaled deeply. "Tommy, I should admit something important." He arched an amused eyebrow. "Should I prepare myself?" "In Chapter 1, she began solemnly, "we don't organise our lives into chapters, Tuppence." "Well, we practically do," she insisted. "In Chapter 1, I claimed the mantelpiece needed reorganising for balance, and you, in your maddeningly calm way, told me nothing had changed on it in 30 years. Tommy folded his hands behind his back, pretending to consider. "I maintain that position." "Yes, but I was wrong." She folded her arms with theatrical reluctance. "Perhaps symmetry isn't everything." Tommy looked at her, surprised and delighted. "Is this a documented admission? Should I write it down?" "You will do no such thing," Tuppence retorted. "I mean only that a mantelpiece, like a mystery, sometimes requires a little chaos before it can settle properly." Tommy laughed. "Then our mantelpiece is certainly settled." She nudged him gently. "Smugness doesn't suit you, dear." "It suits me perfectly," he corrected with cheerful defiance. Their light bickering softened into companionable silence. Birds sang somewhere near the reeds. A narrowboat bell chimed in the distance. The canal, once filled with secrets, now seemed to move with gentler intention. As they reached the inn to collect their luggage, the landlady, no longer Mrs. Hawthorne but her timid assistant, hurried over with a brown paper parcel. "This came for you," she said, "delivered by Mrs. Vale this morning." Tuppence accepted it with curiosity. "Thank you." They stepped outside before opening it. Tommy teased, "A farewell bomb." "Don't be dramatic," Tuppence said, though she was smiling. Inside the parcel, cushioned with tissue paper, was a painting. Mrs. Vale's Canal painting, the one they had first seen obscured by those heavy green strokes. Now restored. No harsh patches, no concealment. The towpath glowed in faint moonlight, the water reflecting a soft silver line. A house stood beside the canal in its original pale cream hue, peaceful and open as a story told truthfully at last. A small note lay atop it. "To those who helped repaint my past." Imogen Vale. Tuppence pressed a hand to her heart. "Oh, Tommy, how lovely, truly lovely." Tommy traced the edge of the frame. "She's reclaiming her story and giving us a piece of it." Tuppence smiled. "We shall hang it in the living room, right above the mantelpiece." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "But won't that disrupt the sacred balance?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Balance, yes, but not beauty, as long as we don't reorganize every week. I make no such promise." He sighed dramatically. "I feared as much." They handed their luggage to the station porter, walked to their platform, and settled onto a bench as the train approached from the horizon with a distant rhythmic rumble. Tommy said, "You know, for a quiet painting job, this turned out to be remarkably eventful." Tuppence replied, "Most things do, when we're involved." The station's clock ticked. A pigeon fluttered onto the roof beams. Steam hissed along the train's undercarriage, filling the air with warm metallic breath. Tommy added, "We never did resolve the living room debate." "Ah, yes," Tuppence said mischievously. "I still believe the chairs should angle toward the fireplace. It creates conversation." Tommy shook his head. "It creates drafts." "Only for tall people. You're fine." He gave her a wounded look. "I endure much for this marriage." She patted his hand. "Nonsense, darling. You thrive on it." The conductor signalled boarding. They stepped onto the train, found a pair of seats and settled in. Tuppence placed Mrs. Vale's painting carefully on her lap, admiring the brushwork. Tommy glanced at it and said softly, "A house finding its colour again." Tuppence nodded. A past finding honesty, a woman finding peace, and a village finding room to heal. Tommy regarded her warmly. "You do get poetic when mysteries conclude. I might get poetic more often if you allowed me to buy that new mantel vase." "We're not discussing the vase." "We are absolutely discussing the vase." Their laughter wove together like familiar music as the train lurched into motion, carrying them away from Little Wyvern and toward whatever adventure awaited next. From the window, the towpath and the canal drifted past, softened by distance no longer marked by tension or secrets. The cream-coloured house appeared once more, perched modestly by the water, sunlight resting gently upon its fresh, honest facade. Tuppence leaned her head against Tommy's shoulder, ready for the next mystery. "Always," he said, and hand in hand, with the painting safely cradled and their good-natured argument over home decor well underway, they rode toward the horizon, balanced imperfectly, beautifully, and together.